Hey people, it's me again. So, anyways, um, one of the other things that I want to talk about here today is um, that Clownfish TV, and I think a couple of other people had talked about this sort of thing when it comes to the state of YouTube at this point, and that people are like fearing the end of just YouTube, as in just, user generated stuff at this point. And mainly it was because of how it was probably was more like a 5 or 10 year plan. Maybe about 5 or 10 years ago, when certain people were saying things about how YouTube is slowly trying to become like Netflix or Hulu, um, any of the other ones, because of that, and because they're just trying to make a profit in some ways. And I think that was just what was the bigger systemic changes when it comes to that, as far as certain algorithmic changes over the years that people, had issues with. And and of course one was just the whole thing with whatchamacallit, um the adpocalypse, because it's almost been like 10 years since we had adpocalypse, and then Elsa Gate and all this other stuff that was going on. But it was also been like 10 years since, you know, when it came to like that particular era of YouTube, you know, when it was like Keemstar, Drama Alert, and Scores, Pyrocynical, and all these crazies at the time, you know. And then there was this other era of this, and then this other era of that, and all that, but that was just one of those little things again. But as far as that goes, at that same time, there was a bit of a viable alternative to YouTube, and that was Vine. And then later on, it's now TikTok. But if somehow TikTok becomes, you know, just as big as YouTube or even bigger than YouTube, then it then YouTube would have to change in some ways in order to adapt to um, everything else at this point. Even though I don't really necessarily like TikTok that much, but still, I have this sort of feeling that maybe YouTube will still be around in 5 or 10 years, but it's just the current form of it is just going to shift a little bit, because in certain ways, as I said earlier about PewDiePie leaving YouTube, but it's also the fact that there are certain people that are just going to retire, because that's just the natural progression of things, as far as that goes, because PewDiePie himself, Felix, he's now going to be 36, and you know next year or something like that, and so he needs to kind of do wants to do something else and all that, and then a lot of other people that have been like in the early days of YouTube had retired at certain points and all of that, and after all, it was like when it came to YouTube itself, when it first began, I was 24, and here I am now 44, and I'm going to be like 45 in 6 months from now. And so that is like another thing that, you know, is just one of those little things there. But still, um, I think when it comes to the grand scheme of things, that this is just simply, YouTube's way of trying to get more money, as far as that goes, especially since, other strategies are trying to placate to certain advertisers isn't going to bode well in the long run, you know. So, Anyways, I guess that's probably it. So talk to you guys later.